Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power or desire to please or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, we have several guests joining us, and joining guests of the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism, and the Status of Women. In the gallery today, if you are a guest of the Status of Women, Culture, Multiculturalism, I invite you to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. I just might give members a chance to have a quick seat here if you want to find yourself a spot. Well, honourable members, one of the most unusual aspects of the past few months inside the chamber has certainly been the absence of the legislative pages. I think it goes without saying that only folks possibly missing the pages more than the members is members of the LASS team, who of course have been doing a fine job in their absence, but this does lead me to an important statement that I have to make before proceeding this afternoon with the regular business. And as some of you may have noticed, some familiar faces in the gallery today, as has been a custom. Each year, the retiring pages join us here in the gallery, and they have penned a letter which I will now read to you. Mr. Speaker, as the House continues to sit through the summer, the pages are faced with the sad realization that some of us may not be returning next fall. In light of this, we, the retiring pages, would like to express our sincerest gratitude for the extraordinary opportunity we have been provided to serve the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. We would like to thank the many people who have shaped not only our experience as pages, but us as individuals as well. The Sergeant-at-Arms, whose exceptional leadership has guided us through our time in the program. The table officers, whose breadth of knowledge is unmatched. The staff of 315, 325, and 412, whose kindness and their dedication to their work has served as an inspiration. And the LASS, whose good humor made a many late-night sitting seem less long. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we would like to thank you and all other members of the Legislative Assembly, without whom our role in the chamber would not exist. While our time in the chamber has come to a close, we part with much more than memories. Our time in the PAGE program has allowed us to grow into engaged, active citizens who have seen the inner workings of governance firsthand, a privilege granted to few. We will carry the friendship, memories, and skills we have gained throughout our time in the PAGE program with us as we embark on the next chapter of our lives. It has been an honor to serve you. Sincerely, Head Page Amber Edgerton, Peer Page Mentor Claire Westhall, Caitlin Cohen, Yoshius Allen, Sierra Goosen, Mariah Kalapural, Aaron Cripps, Benjamin Lehman, and of course, perhaps Member Sigurdsson's favorite son, Wade Sigurdsson. Honourable members, Please join me in expressing our gratitude to this exemplary group of young Albertans for their professionalism, Pages, thank you so very much for your professionalism, determination in which you've carried out your jobs and duties. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors and successes, and with any good fortune, none of you will take our job in the next provincial election.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
UCP says they need to delay the report to Albertans on the true state of our deficit and economy because of the pandemic. The Premier told us the delay was because the Auditor General asked for it. Politicians don't usually make stuff up about the Auditor General, given their independence, their reputation, their role in holding all governments accountable. But the usual rules don't apply in this instance. This government did make stuff up about the Auditor General. They misled Albertans about budget reporting. Here's what happened. In April, the Ministry of Finance approached the AG asking to delay the 2019 report. And then in May, the Minister of Finance started to peddle a fiction. He said, in response to a question from me, and I quote, "We've heard from the Auditor General that they would not be able to actually complete their audit work by June 30th. The problem is that's not what he heard from the AG. We know because we asked. When it became clear yesterday what actually happened, we realized the depth and seriousness of the government's false statements. In documents we will submit today, our first available opportunity, the Auditor General says, to the Auditor General's knowledge, we never stated any concern about our capability to complete financial statement audit work by June. The AG's office was so concerned by the Minister's answers to my May questions, they asked the Minister to correct the record. The Ministry did so behind the scenes, confirming that the delay was what the government wanted. And then the government introduced a bill that formally delays reporting on Budget 219. Answering questions on Monday, the Premier blamed the AG 8 times, knowingly and falsely attributing statements to the Auditor General. Why would the Premier do this? Here's why. Alberta's economy before the pandemic was in a shambles. The jobs plan had miserably failed. But nothing is more serious than this UCP government misleading Albertans about the true state of our finances. The Premier has breached a number of serious rules in this House. He must rise in this House and take responsibility for his actions.
The Honourable Member for Leduc-Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand to recognize Ptsd Awareness Day, which takes place each year on June 27th. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a psychological response to the experience of intense traumatic events. Mr. Speaker, members of the Canadian Armed Forces have a higher risk of developing PTSD in their lifetimes than most other Canadians. In fact, up to 10% of Canada's veterans may experience PTSD at some point in their lives. Symptoms of PTSD can include flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares, gaps in memories, difficulty concentrating, and more. The effects of PTSD can have on individuals and their families and friends can be devastating. I have had the privilege to support Heroes in Mind Advocacy and Research Consortium at the University of Alberta, or HIMARC for short. They have put in a tremendous amount of effort and resources into research, education, and services for our Canadian Forces members, veterans, and public safety personnel. Specializing in mental health, HIMARC helps provide transformative change to health, well-being, and quality of life through technological innovation and rehabilitation. They have done fantastic work to help frontline workers deal with mental health issues, especially PTSD. And I am grateful for the government in supporting the work of HIMARC for military members, veterans, and first responders. Mr. Speaker, I want Albertans to know that if they or a loved one is a military veteran who is experiencing PTSD, that help is available. The Canadian Forces Member Assistance Program offers a voluntary, confidential telephone counseling service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and help is a phone call away at 1-800-268-7708. Our government is proud to support the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces. We are grateful for the work our Armed Forces members are doing here, at home, and abroad. As we mark PTSD Awareness Day, I encourage Albertans to help spread awareness of PTSD and the resources that are available for those who are suffering from it. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe because of how we were raised out in the rural areas, it actually allows us to hit it off quicker with folks, as we genuinely like to meet new people and to listen to them. As one of the MLAs that boarded the City of Edmonton, I've worked in the city for most of my career and have a number of friends that call this city home. I've apparently developed a reputation as an MLA that listens out in my constituency and as well here in the greater Edmonton area. However, I was contacted by the folks from Chinatown community to have lunch and to talk about the safety issues they were taking here. I was a little taken aback. It didn't take long to get down to the brass tacks of the issue. These folks were steamrolled by the city, the former NDP government, and the federal Liberal government. Why was it that their 4,000-person petition fell on deaf ears? Why was it the protest was not respected? Why was it their MLAs from City Centre and Edmonton Highwoods Norwood didn't hear them? Could only surmise that the concerns from Chinatown were not valid because it didn't fit with their harm reduction ideology. Why is it that the 3 supervised consumption sites in a city with a population around 1 million people are located with a stone's throw from each other? The concerns of the folks in Chinatown are not so dissimilar to the rural crime issues being experienced elsewhere in the province. The challenges that we are living and having in rural areas is related to drugs, and Chinatown is the same thing. And Mr. Speaker, it's because they are related. I wonder if the same level of engagement, consultation, and consideration was given to the constituents of Edmonton Strathcona, Edmonton Galora, maybe even Edmonton Rutherford regarding the placement of consumption sites. Would their petitions and concerns have fallen on deaf ears the way they fell on the deaf ears from the folks from Chinatown? I'm proud to say I'm not the only new cowboy in town. Our Minister of Mental Health Addiction is fixing the problems, not just masking the issues. He has his ears on too, Mr. Speaker, and the folks in Chinatown will have a voice again in this place.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Premier is determined to bring dark money back into Alberta politics. This government is introducing new ways for those with deep pockets and special interests to interfere with our provincial elections with Bill 26 and 27. And now they're doing the same thing to our municipal elections with Bill 29. It's disgraceful. This bad bill allows a person to get up to $10,000 to each candidate they choose. They'll be able to donate $5,000 before polling day and then another $5,000 after the election to help pay off debts. Therefore, a person with a vested interest can donate up to $10,000 to the candidate they support and then donate another $10,000 to prop up a different candidate in an attempt to discredit a valid competitor of the candidate they want to win. Some might call that a kamikaze campaign. This bad bill allows completely to remove the limits on third-party contributions, opening the door to unlimited money to our local elections, putting our municipal councils and school boards up for sale to the highest bidder. Also, this bad bill is reducing transparency for Alberta voters. It prevents voters from knowing who is paying for a candidate's campaign until after the election. The Minister of Municipal Affairs claims that the changes to the donation disclosure process is to, quote, reduce red tape. Transparency and accountability are not red tape, Mr. Speaker. They are a necessity for a true democracy. Why should Alberta be any different? And let's remember that this Premier campaigned on getting big money out of politics. Unfortunately, this is one more broken promise from him. Bill 29 undermines the democratic powers of each Albertan and puts those with the deepest pockets in the driver's seat for our local future councils. Plain and simple. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After months of work, along with the rest of my colleagues on the Fair Deal panel, we submitted our report on getting Alberta a fair deal. With the endless, ridiculous barrage of overreaching policies from the Trudeau government, we must be more vigilant than ever when it comes to provincial jurisdiction. We must be able to exercise our constitutional rights and make sure that we do not surrender these points. That is the desire that guided our work on the panel. One area of particular concern for us presently is a federal gun ban that is taking place. More and more firearms are being added to the list monthly. Many of them, Mr. Speaker, not even firearms, but many that are airsoft guns like the Blackwater BW-15. What is a Blackwater BW-15, you might ask? It's a toy airsoft gun. However, there are solutions that were presented in our report. One of the recommendations made was for Alberta to appoint its own chief firearms officer. I would like to express my appreciation to the Minister of Justice for accepting that recommendation. This is the first step in asserting our constitutional right to oversee firearms in Alberta. While I applaud the acceptance of this, I also encourage the government to accept the recommendation of the replacement of the RCMP for a provincial police force. In many ways, the RCMP have done a great job keeping us safe over the years. However, they take their policy direction straight from Ottawa, which is clearly more and more concerning. This recommendation will go hand in hand with the appointment of a chief firearms officer in ensuring that the Alberta flavor of firearms enforcement is upheld. As an additional measure, I would like to suggest we make the position of chief firearms officer one that is elected, and elected perhaps by those that hold firearms permits in the same spirit that we're going to hold Senate elections. Also, I think I would like to go a long way for a hypothetical Alberta police chief to also be elected, similar to many jurisdictions in the United States. Again, I encourage the Minister of Justice to proceed quickly with the installation of a chief firearms officer so we can rightly assert our jurisdiction.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To make progress on our path to reconciliation, we need to make sure that Alberta's Indigenous people can fully participate in economic, social, cultural and political life of the province. On this path, we have a long way to go. We know that the average income of Indigenous communities that had the most most opportunity to participate in Alberta's resource wealth is still lower than average income of all Albertans. We must do better. We must make sure that Indigenous people in Alberta have a role and say in resource development and decisions impacting their communities. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People clearly states in Article 26(2), and I quote, "Indigenous people have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired." We as a province need to honor that commitment. That means not only we consult adequately on resource development with Indigenous communities, but also ensure they have the capacity to participate in those decisions. And they are the one making the decisions about resource development that is best for their communities. Our Indigenous people must benefit from the prosperity flowing from the resource development, and that is why we need to move forward with a model of revenue sharing that is fair, adequate, and acceptable to them. So today, I call on the government to take meaningful steps to move forward on this path and to work with Alberta's Indigenous people to establish a revenue sharing model that is fair and furthers our shared goal of reconciliation. As opposition, we are here to work with the government and Indigenous communities towards that end. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Bonneville-Cold Lake St. Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, the federal Liberals are at it again. They didn't learn from their long gun registry mistake, so they had to one-up themselves and ban all assault-style guns, among many others. What this does is turn legal gun owners like myself into criminals. It also hurts small-town businesses in my riding of Bonneville-Cold Lake St. Paul. Sylvester Source for Sports, a local gun dealer in Bonneville, told me recently, and I quote, "Our restricted firearms, handguns, and ARs are a big part of our business. It's just the start of the game Public Safety Minister Bill Blair is playing. Eventually, he wants to take them all," end quote. Already they have 20 to 30 guns in stock that they cannot sell anymore. Even in St. Paul, the local gun dealer Warehouse Sports told me, and I quote, If this does not get reversed, I will be out of business. Like most other hunting and firearms stores, I cannot survive on selling Red Devils and bobbers. In case you don't know that, Mr. Trudeau, that's a fishhook," end quote. The federal Liberals don't even know what they're banning anymore. The legislation says any AK-47 replica gun is banned in our country. Well, those come in many forms, Mr. Speaker. We have an AK-47 water gun, an AK-47 BB gun, and we even have an AK-47 style paintball gun. My point is, you can dress a paintball gun up like an AK-47, makes it no more an assault weapon than if you dressed Justin Trudeau up as Einstein and expected him to be a genius. Let's crack down on the illegal smuggling of guns coming in from the U.S. before we ever waste our time with legal, law-abiding gun owners such as myself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka.
Low-carbon, low-cost oil has arrived in central Alberta. I applaud the many contributors and stakeholders who have made the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line a reality. Last month, the Carbon Trunk Line system became operational. It is the world's newest and largest integrated carbon capture, utilization, and storage system. It runs 240 kilometres from the industrial heartland to Clive, east of Lacombe. Designed and built to support a low-carbon economy in Alberta, this system captures industrial CO2 emissions and delivers that CO2 to mature oil and gas reservoirs to enhance oil recovery and for permanent storage, reducing greenhouse gases. It is capable of transporting up to 14.6 million tons of CO2 a year, equal to 20% of all oil sands emissions or 2.6 million automobile emissions. Wolf Midstream manages the trunk line. Enhance Energy purchases the CO2 and pumps it into deleted reservoirs, facilitating the projected recovery of up to 1 billion barrels of near net zero environmentally responsible energy for Albertans. I quote Enhance Energy, "The future of a low-carbon economy relies on key infrastructure like the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line system to provide sustainable solutions to global energy requirements." Mr. Speaker, not only is this pipeline great for the future of this province, but as well for the future of central Alberta. It will provide local jobs and investment. And carbon is a non-toxic, non-volatile, inert substance that holds no risk to local citizens or landowners. Let the world know Alberta innovation delivers on the cleanest oil in the world. And to quote Enhance Energy again, no other crude oil produced in the world will have a lower net carbon impact on the environment. For investors and those who care about ESG, this is good news.
Honourable members, it is now time for oral question period. And the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier wants this House to pass legislation that would hide reports on his government's economic and fiscal performance last year. When I asked the Premier to explain this, he called me names, as usual, and then he tried to blame the Auditor General. He said the AG, quote, indicated their office is not capable of completing the review of the fiscal books at this point, end quote. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not true. The AG has since confirmed to us that they did not make this request to the Premier. Why did you mislead the House?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to COVID, the Office of the Auditor General, as was the case for many Alberta businesses, were required to adjust their normal course of operations. The AG office issued a number of news releases indicating that they were closing their Edmonton and Calgary offices and discontinuing on-site audits. Mr. Speaker, given the fact that there's 171 government reporting entities and given the time restraints and the restraints due to COVID, it was unrealistic, Mr. Speaker, to expect public servants to deliver in that type time frame.
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Premier's not answering, and the Finance Minister seems to be doubling down, but the AG's office wrote, and I quote, the decision to extend the 2019-2020 year-end reporting period was a decision made by the government, not the Office of the Auditor General. Quote, we never stated any concerns about being able to complete our financial statement audit work by June 30th, end quote. Premier, we're now on the third reading of Bill 24, and the entire debate has been based on falsehoods. Will you acknowledge you misled the House, breached the privilege of these members, and apologize?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my department reached out very early to the Auditor General on the decision to delay the issuance of the Government of Alberta annual report, and they too agreed that it was reasonable under the circumstances to delay and, in fact, express concerns with the very tight deadline. Again, Mr. Speaker, for the departments to prepare the annual reports, for the whole audit process to continue in a very tight timeline, given the COVID restrictions, Mr. Speaker, actually would have put public servants' health in jeopardy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, it's lovely that the finance minister is now changing his story, but the problem is that members of this House were asked to debate a bill on the basis of a different story, a story told by the Premier, a previous story told by the minister, a story that was full of things that were not true. They misled the House. They breached our privilege. They must withdraw the bill. They must apologize to the House. Premier, will you or will you not take responsibility?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, our first priority is for the health and safety of Albertans and the health and safety of our public service. Mr. Speaker, given the very tight timelines, of which Alberta has the tightest reporting timeline of any other province, a 3-month reporting deadline after our year end, given those tight timelines, and given our first priority of the health and public safety of our public sector workers, Mr. Speaker, Bill 24 and our assertion, our plan to delay the reporting requirement is very responsible.
Order. I might just provide a little word of caution here. There is, I understand that the Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods has raised a point of privilege on this very issue, which will be heard at its earliest opportunity. So just be cautious with those who might consider making accusations about what did or did not happen, as I'm very interested in hearing about this very important matter at the point when a point of privilege would be raised. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, June is Indigenous or National Indigenous History Month. It's time for us to reflect upon the history, the sacrifices, and the contributions of Indigenous people. Today, our caucus will be relating the remainder of our questions to Indigenous concerns. But first, the Premier must address the profoundly racist views of his speechwriter, who called the residential schools experience of Indigenous people a, quote, bogus genocide story, end quote. Mr. Speaker, thousands of children were killed and generations were traumatized. These words extend that trauma. Premier, will you sever this individual from your office immediately?
The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no question that residential schools were horrific and immoral, where generations of Indigenous children were taken from their parents. Mr. Speaker, our Premier was a member of the Harper government that gave the historic apology for residential schools. He sat personally in the House of Commons on that historic day and was a member of that government that created the historic Truth and Reconciliation so that stories of abuse could be told. Mr. Speaker, our government's record on supporting First Nations and Indigenous communities is well documented.
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Premier is also the leader of a government right now that chose to hire someone to work in the highest office of this government who claims that for many Indigenous children, residential schools, quote, rescued them from ignorance, privation, and violence at home. He also says the late Harold Cardinal is the, quote, primary author of the modern Canadian Aboriginal grievance and entitlement narrative, end quote. Will the Premier apologize to each and every Indigenous Albertan for the words of his staff, and will he fire him today?
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We fundamentally disagree with what the speechwriter said years ago as a journalist. We as Canadians are still coming to terms with the terrible devastation of our Indigenous communities through the regime of Indian residential schools, where children were literally torn away from their parents, where families were destroyed by the abusive power of the state in an effort to completely pull these children away from their families, their communities, and their cultures. Mr. Speaker, our government's record in supporting First Nations and Indigenous communities is well documented and speaks for itself.
Leader.
What's well documented is Mr. Bunner's writings, where he also diminished the experience of Indigenous children at residential schools by comparing them to the white kids who, quote, grew up in sod huts on the prairies, endured the horrors of the Depression and the World Wars, and somehow got through it without imagining they were the victims of a racist conspiracy. This Premier deposited this man into the highest office of this province. How can he possibly believe it is okay to take any advice from someone who harbors such hateful, racist, and illegal values?
The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt what those words were truly horrific, and we fundamentally disagree with them. Mr. Speaker, our government has done a number of great initiatives for the First Nations, from restoring the annual All-Chief Summit that the NDP cancelled. They cancelled it, Mr. Speaker, to the creation of the first of its kind ever, anywhere, of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation and the Alberta Indigenous Litigation Fund. Our government has clearly and consistently taken a leadership role supporting First Nations as true equal partners in prosperity.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Premier, on 3 occasions I've asked your Minister of Indigenous Relations if the experience of First Nations in Canada can be described as genocide. Every time I did so, your minister failed to answer the question. Today we learned that your speechwriter has explicitly said that it was not genocide, and believing it was makes Canadians suckers for a never-ending demand for tax dollars and greater political autonomy. Premier, I will provide you with the opportunity to set the record straight. Was the colonization of First Nations people a genocide?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as it is National Indigenous History Month, and we just had Indigenous Peoples Day, they're in our hearts always. And I've talked to several chiefs this morning about this subject, and we talked sincerely about it. And Grand Chief Morin, he said to me, you guys are doing true reconciliation, true action. He says, some of the actions you've taken, like the Alberta Indigenous Opportunity Corporation, that's true reconciliation. That's what we want to see, and this government is taking action.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Premier, a year ago I asked your Minister of Indigenous Relations, does this government acknowledge the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to free, prior and informed consent with matters regarding their treaty rights outlined in Treaties 6, 7 and 8? The Minister said that he would get back to me. I'm going to ask the Premier instead, here and now, to answer. It's been a year. Does your government accept the right to free, prior and informed consent? Please explain what you know about this important matter.
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And former Grand Chief Willie Littlechild is not only a friend but a mentor of mine. And literally the day before the election last year, he says, you know, I have a meeting with the man who's going to be the next Premier. You should come with me. And we did. And I thought we'd get a 5-minute meeting because I couldn't even get to see him. Seriously, Mr. Speaker, a 3-hour meeting with the Premier, with the Grand Chief, and he talked to us from his heart. That's how chiefs talk. They talk from their heart. And he talked to me about truth and reconciliation. And he was the author of that, Mr. Speaker. And I grew up, the first man I ever voted for was Grand Chief.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Premier, the Grand Chief of Treaty 8, Chief Arthur Noski, has said that it is important that the government acknowledge their acceptance of the treaty signed on June 21st, 1899. And he specifically requests that the government acknowledge that the treaty is a rights-based document that defines not only an agreement to share the land, but establishes First Nations rights to governance and resource sharing. Premier, does the government of Alberta acknowledge that in signing Treaties 6, 7, and 8, we accepted the establishment in law of First Nations rights?
Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we do honour the inherent rights of the treaties, and we work closely with all the First Nations, and we honour them. And just this week, myself and the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and Status of Women honoured the First Nations people. We couldn't be with them like we were last year for the powwows, but we did it virtually, and it was an honour to do that with her. And we've just worked constantly and hard to build relationships with the First Nations people.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View has a question.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday charges against Chief Alan Adam were dropped. Chief Adam suffered serious injuries in this incident, and ultimately the Crown could not even pursue the underlying charges. This is a serious concern. Yet, he has not acted with retribution. He has a simple request that the police work to better understand Indigenous people. To the Premier, will you heed Chief Adams' cry and ensure that police and, in fact, all participants in the justice system receive cross-cultural training? And what other steps are you taking to combat systemic racism?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we announced weeks ago that we're undertaking a Police Act review, Mr. Speaker. That work is going on right now. We're engaging with First Nation leaders, Mr. Speaker. We've already talked with all of the First Nation police services, their chiefs of police, Mr. Speaker. We've talked to them about the future of Indigenous policing. We've also called on the federal government to do the same thing with the RCMP. We don't have full responsibility for the RCMP and the legislation that governs them, but we've called on the federal government to do the same thing, and I believe the Federal Minister of Public Safety is going to do just that, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to those conversations. They're going to be needed.
Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you. In response to the brutal arrest of Chief Alan Adam and other concerns raised by racialized communities, the UCP has committed to pick up the Police Act review we started in 2018. We worked hard to ensure that a broad range of folks were included in this review and that we started at the beginning. What is the purpose of policing and how do we do it better? This work is incredibly important. To the Premier, will you commit to include Indigenous chiefs and Black Lives Matter in the review process?
Minister of Justice, Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, I want to point something out for this House. That member was Justice Minister for 4 years, and towards the tail end, right towards the end, they just put together a little bit of a consultation, Mr. Speaker. I would say a part consultation on the Police Act and the future of policing, Mr. Speaker. We are expediting this work, Mr. Speaker. We're going to be working with Indigenous leaders across this province. We're going to engage with ethnic communities, Mr. Speaker, to hear their concerns, Mr. Speaker. This is important to this government. We have to get this right. Policing needs to improve, Mr. Speaker. But that being said, I also do want to thank our police officers across this province, Mr. Speaker. We have many good ones out there. We thank them for their work.
Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
It was months of consultation with over 280 participants. Mr. Speaker, the problem with rooting out systemic racism is often all of us failing to recognize our own inherent biases that impact our decision-making without us even knowing it. That's why education and understanding are such powerful tools. How can Indigenous people throughout this province believe the Premier's commitment to root out systemic racism in our institutions when he employs a speechwriter who called the tragic history of residential schools a, quote, bogus genocide story? Will the Premier fire this vile individual and take...
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, the words that I would say to our Indigenous people of the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker, is that actions matter, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to engage. We will continue to work to get this right, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot of work to do. You hear the stories, Mr. Speaker. You hear the hurt and the pain of the past, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot of work to do to build bridges, to make sure we have reconciliation here in the province of Alberta. We are committed to continue to work with him to get the Police Act right, Mr. Speaker, to make sure we have a police service of the future.
Honourable Member for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that many of my constituents were pleased to see the introduction of Bill 26, which will facilitate the future referendum on equalization that was included in our 2019 election platform and was further recommended by the report of the Fair Deal panel. I also know many Albertans are eager to have their say on other items from the report as well. To the Minister of Justice, can you tell the House why the government believes that it is important to entrust decisions on matters of critical importance to the people of Alberta and let them have the final say?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice, Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, this is so clear. You want to know why? Because we trust Albertans to make decisions about their future. The NDP called referendums anti-democratic power grabs, Mr. Speaker. Let that sink in. And a bill that empowers voters to have a direct say on their future. The NDP are heckling, Mr. Speaker. They don't respect voters, Mr. Speaker. This party is empowering voters, Mr. Speaker. We're empowering Albertans to decide the future of Alberta.
Honourable member for Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Fair Deal panel has also recommended that the government introduce legislation to allow for citizen-initiated referenda, and given that in the official government response to the panel's report, it said that work was underway to make this happen, to the Minister of Justice, can you confirm that your department is working on implementing citizen-initiated referenda and putting direct democratic power in the hands of ordinary Albertans?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is working with the members of this legislature right now, Mr. Speaker. We're setting up a committee to review citizens' initiatives, Mr. Speaker, regarding how many signatures should be needed to get certain policies onto a ballot, Mr. Speaker. We want to empower Albertans. I know, Mr. Speaker, that there's been thousands of Albertans that have been asking for this right for so long. This government is delivering on that. This is the broadest electoral reform in the history of our province, Mr. Speaker. We're giving power right to people so that they can have their policies, their decisions on the ballot. We're about empowering people, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member.
Thank you. Given that I understand there are many details to work out, and given that many of the private members are very interested in participating in that process, and given that we want to make sure that we get this legislation right to ensure the effective participation of Albertans in referenda, can the Minister of Justice tell us how the government will be determining the specifics of the legislation and what opportunities private members will have to provide input?
Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, for Albertans that are watching this online, Mr. Speaker, we say to them, reach out to your MLA right now. Tell them what you're looking for in this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Engage in the committee process. They're going to be doing that, Mr. Speaker, over the summer, into the fall. We look forward to bringing forward legislation this fall that will have the specifics on the future of citizens' initiatives, Mr. Speaker. This is a powerful tool, and we want to empower Albertans. We trust Albertans. The NDP called these types of initiatives anti-democratic power grabs, Mr. Speaker. We don't believe that. We trust Albertans, Mr. Speaker. They make the right decisions.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud has a question.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 70% of children in care in Alberta are Indigenous. As a result of the misguided and racist policies of residential schools and the 60s scoop, which forcefully removed Indigenous children from their families, this number is not just a statistic. It represents intergenerational trauma and systemic racism in the child intervention process. To the Premier, what work is your government doing to end this disparity affecting Indigenous children, and how is it implementing the all-party recommendations of the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention? And please be specific.
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really want to, through you, to the member opposite, thank her for asking this very thoughtful question about an issue that is hugely important to me and to this government. I can tell you that work on the panel report recommendations continues in our ministry through our policies. Much of this work, almost most of the long, medium, and short-term recommendations have been put in place. However, at the time of this report, things have changed quite a bit with the introduction of Bill C-92 at the federal level. What I can tell you is that I continue to work with First Nations and Métis leadership across this province to bring that number.
Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that one of the recommendations of the panel was to improve supports for youth transitioning to adulthood, and given that this government is currently appealing a court ruling which blocked them from lowering the age of supports for former foster children, leaving hundreds of Indigenous young people without critical supports to transition successfully to adulthood, something the court described as cruel and unusual punishment, can the Minister of Children's Services explain to this House the rationale behind this change to a life-saving program which disproportionately affects Indigenous young people?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had a number of discussions about this, both with the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate as well as many of our Indigenous serving community-based organizations around what the most important thing is when it comes to supports for young adults transitioning out of the child intervention system. And Mr. Speaker, by and large, that is a smooth transition that focuses on building lifelong connections in that young adult's life so that they can continue to succeed. We also have the Advancing Futures programs, a unique program here in Alberta that supports young adults transitioning out of care, looking to go into post-secondary or upgrading high school education.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate did not support the government's decision to lower the age of supports for former foster children, and given that the principles outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Jordan's Principle were embraced in previous Children's Services business plans as guiding principles to address inadequate and inequitable access to services by Indigenous children, and given that the first business plan issued by this minister has dropped all references to UNDRIP and to Jordan's Principle, to the minister, are you still committed to these principles? And if you are, why are they no longer considered a critical part of the work of your ministry?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jordan's Principle has been fully implemented here in the province of Alberta, and it was not at the time of the all-party review. We continue to work with First Nations and Métis leadership across this province. It was hugely important to me and to this government. The Premier reinstated the meetings, the government-to-government meetings between First Nations and Métis leadership and our government colleagues, and I can tell you that in our second meeting, the discussion was exactly about this. How can we reduce the number of Indigenous children in government care? We want to make sure that children are supported, families are supported, and kids can stay connected with their communities, their culture, and their families.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
We are all aware of the anti-racism demonstrations around the world. One of the key issues emerging from this movement is the lack of affordable housing. This UCP government reduced the $120 million Indigenous Housing Capital Plan to $35 million over 4 years. To the Minister of Seniors and Housing, why did you slash the budget for affordable housing, leaving thousands of Indigenous people in Alberta without affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to working with the colleagues in Indigenous relations and Indigenous community across Alberta to review the current program and also improve it to better serve Indigenous community. We are committed to the strong and respectful relationship with Indigenous people who are vital to our province's social, economics, and cultural fabric.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that there are currently more than 6,000 homeless Albertans and Indigenous people are overrepresented in this group, and given that the Alberta Rural Development Network released a 40-page report in April showing that there is an increasing need for more affordable housing due to COVID-19 pandemic, to the Minister, since the publishing of this report, has your ministry consulted with housing providers to implement some of the study's findings?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the affordable housing is extremely important in Albertans who's in need most. And we definitely identified that. And we will continue to do that. And beside that, for housing, in operating budget, we got allocated $263 million and capital $417 million for affordable housing. We are continuous to working for nonprofit organizations and all the stakeholders, all the partners that continue to build housing for those Albertans and who need it most. Thank you.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And given that the most recent budget had no new money for affordable housing, and given that the community agencies report a growing number of Alberta families at risk of homelessness due to the lack of affordable housing, and given our government invested $1.2 billion in housing while you cut the Indigenous Housing Capital Plan, to the Minister of Seniors and Housing, you frequently brag about your pandemic response. Why didn't you include investing in affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we are looking after our Albertan, especially in affordable housing, Mr. Speaker. The previous NDP government failed Indigenous people in Alberta, Mr. Speaker. They needed affordable housing under the Indigenous Housing Capital Program, not build one unit under the government. And our government is committed to begin a true partner with Alberta Indigenous community. And just for the record, our Minister of Indigenous has been doing a fantastic job in connecting with the Indigenous people. We are continuing to do that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to doing everything we can to protect our children and most vulnerable. That is why yesterday, the Minister of Service Alberta tabled legislation to protect Albertan families by preventing convicted sex offenders from having the ability to legally change their names. I'm sure that this loophole is shocking to most Albertans, but I'm wondering, to the Minister through you, is this a problem in Alberta that convicted sex offenders are legally changing their names and reoffending?
The Honourable Minister of Service Alberta has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Yesterday at the announcement, when we announced this bill, I was pleased to be joined by Cheryl Diebel, the CEO of the Zebra Child Protection Center here in Edmonton. And she shared with us an example of how shortly after I had first been engaging with her office in February about this matter, that within a week of that conversation, they had learned of a case in their office of an example where a convicted sex offender had changed their name. This does happen. It can happen. One case, Mr. Speaker, is too many. That's why we're acting to close this loophole.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given the vast majority of Albertans who want to change their names are law-abiding citizens with personal and justifiable reasons for changing their names, and given those Albertans want to be sure that they can still change their names without a problem, to the same Minister, how will law-abiding Albertans be affected by this change to legislation?
The Honourable Minister of Service Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just be perfectly clear through you to all Albertans. Nothing will interfere with the freedom of law-abiding Albertans to legally change their names. But you know what else will affect law-abiding Albertans is that they're going to feel safer in their communities, because we are closing this loophole to ensure that convicted sex offenders can never change their names in Alberta. This is important. This has got broad support from child advocacy centres all across the province, and this is a really important step forward to making Alberta a safe place.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that convicted sex offenders are still able to move across the country and change their names to hide from their past, and given that this legislation was put forward by this government to help further our platform commitment to protect vulnerable Albertans and close such gaps as these, to the same Minister, is there still a loophole because not all provinces have these same strong protections?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this is a really great question. Obviously, we're taking this action here in Alberta because this is a very important matter of public safety. But this is important that we also have a pan-Canadian approach. And that is why yesterday I wrote to every single province and territory in this country, urging them to join us in implementing these strong protections all across the country. And I will not rest until we have delivered these important changes all across the country to protect not just Albertans but all Canadians. And Albertans will be more safe if the rest of Canada joins us in this effort.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert has a question.
Rosecrest is home to medically fragile children with complex disabilities. Some are there because of illness, some trauma, and some were born with disabilities. 70% of the children receiving 24/7 care there now are Indigenous. Some of the kids receiving palliative care at Rosecrest are also Indigenous, and the staff call it their love program. All of the parents, guardians of these children receive 90-day notice that their supports may change during a pandemic. Minister, other than cutting your budget to pay for your Premier's corporate giveaways, what is the motivation for upending the lives of the children at Rosecrest?
The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, there are medically fragile children all across this province who are being cared for right now by families in the Ptsd program and by civil society partners and not-for-profits. And in fact, 90% of disabled Albertans are cared for by civil society partners. And right now, we are just consulting. No decisions have been made, and we are only in the consultation phase.
Albert has the call.
Given some of the kids at Rosecrest are in Edmonton because their home communities do not have the capacity in terms of staff expertise, access to unique health care, equipment, and therapies to meet their complex needs, and given these kids clearly have underlying medical conditions and many are likely immunocompromised, therefore higher risk for COVID-19. Minister, please explain to the families, some are here today, why the UCP government has chosen to introduce more risk into the lives of these children during a pandemic.
The Honourable The Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very concerned about the rhetoric that is being perpetuated by the member from St. Albert, because that is not the case. We care deeply about medically fragile children and people with disabilities, and right now we are just exploring the best possible methods of delivery to make sure that these children are cared for. We are in the consultation phase right now, and no decisions have been made, and certainly when we are going to make any decisions, we will engage with parents and all stakeholders and bring them along with us. That is my commitment.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Given the off chance that the UCP didn't realize what they'd be risking when they gave the staff, parents, and guardians 90-day notice that supports would be upended, and given that now we've made it abundantly clear of the harm that you've caused, Minister, will you commit to immediately halting this dangerous path you are on, commit to actual consultation with families, communities, and the physicians who care for these children before more harm is done? They're here. You can meet with them right after question period.
The Honourable Member for Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, there is no risk, there is no harm. We are simply consulting to find the best possible services. We're exploring ideas around how services are delivered, not who pays for them. The Government of Alberta will continue to fund these services, and yes, absolutely, I would be very happy to meet with any family, anybody who wants to meet with me after question period.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
On June 5th, Chantal Moore, a 26-year-old Indigenous woman, was killed by police in New Brunswick. She died the day after the first anniversary of the release of the report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People. She died a week after the federal government admitted it hadn't created a promised action plan to address the inquiry's calls for justice. To the Minister of Justice, the report directs a number of its calls for justice at police forces when informing the best way forward. Which of those measures have you made progress on?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, we are working closely with the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and many of my colleagues in engaging on the future of policing in this province, Mr. Speaker. That work is ongoing right now. I'm looking forward at some point, and hopefully next year, Mr. Speaker, and bringing forward amendments to the Police Act, Mr. Speaker, so we can make changes to make policing better, Mr. Speaker. We've heard that loud and clear from our Indigenous leaders, Mr. Speaker. We have to improve. We have to take action. They sat for 4 years on the other side, did not improve policing, Mr. Speaker. They did not take any steps to improve policing, Mr. Speaker. They even were in favor of carding, Mr. Speaker. Shame.
Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
Given that the Native Women's Association of Canada has sent a letter to all provincial and federal ministers who are responsible for policing, including the Alberta Justice Minister, and given that Alberta has yet to take concrete action on that national report from a year ago in regards to policing, will the minister be actively consulting with Indigenous women across Alberta in preparation for this meeting in July? And if so, how can people get involved? How can I tell them they can get a seat at the table, Minister?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to engage with Indigenous leaders, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy if they've reached out to my office already. I'm looking forward to following up, Mr. Speaker. But I want to ask that member opposite, if they share the views of the member from Calgary Mountain View, that there is no evidence carding discriminates against racial groups or violates other human rights, Mr. Speaker. The NDP right now, they should answer that very question. Because that question right there, Mr. Speaker, is a powerful one. And the people right now in Indigenous communities are asking for leadership on this. Do they share the views of the member from Calgary Mountain View?
Honourable Member for Order, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
Given that the Native Women's Association of Canada have asked that shoot-to-kill orders be revised to make non-violent apprehension a priority when suspects aren't brandishing firearms, and given that some of the duties currently performed by police when called to deal with an Indigenous person who's suffering from a mental health issue may not be turned over to social workers, to health professionals, or to elders, to the Minister, do you acknowledge that people trained in de-escalation rather than use of force should be on the front lines in order to help save lives?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised the member opposite wouldn't answer a simple question about carding, Mr. Speaker. We have so many issues that we need to deal with, Mr. Speaker. We need to get this right, Mr. Speaker. They're heckling right now over a very sensitive topic, Mr. Speaker. Shame on them. They need to listen to people, be humble in this, Mr. Speaker, and listen and engage. We will take action. We're expediting work on the Police Act, Mr. Speaker. While they failed for 4 years to improve policing, Mr. Speaker, we're making real change in Alberta.
The Honourable Member, Order. The Honourable Member for Banff, Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Municipal Affairs tabled several amendments to the Local Authorities Election Act. While these proposed changes to strengthen local democracy were well received by most people across the province, the NDP were quick to dial it up on Twitter and declare the sky was falling. So can the Minister of Municipal Affairs please give some specific examples of just how these proposed changes will actually help level the playing field in the next round of municipal elections and encourage voter participation?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Bath Kananaskis. Mr. Speaker, several of these changes will level the playing field for candidates in local elections, particularly newcomers. For instance, Mr. Speaker, the bill will no longer allow incumbents to carry their war chest over from election to election. Those surpluses will now be donated to charity, and that is a good thing, Mr. Speaker. We are also creating fundraising flexibility so that those who lack public name recognition can attract fundraising dollars and run meaningful and effective campaigns.
Honourable Member for Banff Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Well, given these changes will, if passed, be coming into effect before the next round of local elections, and given that Albertans would expect any changes to the election legislation that governs how our democracy functions be done through extensive consultation with the very voters who partake in our democracy, can the Minister please explain what steps he took to consult with Albertans and stakeholders before tabling Bill 29?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member once again. Mr. Speaker, we conducted an extensive consultation that included online survey that over 5,100 Albertans responded to, and targeted stakeholder meetings with voters, advocacy groups, school boards, municipalities, and municipal associations. Mr. Speaker, as a result, it's no surprise that we are seeing tremendous support for this bill. AUMA President Barry Mochida said, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, AUMA and its members support many of these practical changes. Mr. Speaker, we did the hard work that the NDP didn't do when they were in office.
Member for Banff Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, given these proposed changes are being embraced by people across the political spectrum, including both columnists and local elected leaders, yet somehow given that the misguided new Democratic Party is now claiming that allowing Albertans direct votes on things that affect them through referendum is undemocratic, when it clearly actually strengthens our democracy, can the Minister please explain why there is such a large disconnect on legislation like this between the NDP and ordinary everyday Albertans?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is that the new Democratic Party simply doesn't support democracy. They don't want to level the playing field for candidates in local elections or increase the dismal level of voter participation in this province. They don't even want Albertans voting on referendum. That is how bad these folks on the other side are. They are angry at the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, but we are not, because we trust the people. We are proud of these changes, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Edmonton City Centre has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, systemic racism continues to be a barrier to Indigenous people in getting the health care they need in Alberta. Reports of long waits, skepticism, and even hostility towards Indigenous patients are not acceptable. In 2019, the previous government began a process to provide mandatory cultural training for all AHS workers. It's a big project. It is only a first step. Can the Minister of Health update the House on the progress of that training and describe in detail his additional plans to confront racism in healthcare?
Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the thoughtful question. This is an issue that's near and dear to me. In a previous life, I was actually counsel to two of our Blackfoot nations in Alberta, and actually just last week met with Siksika to be able to speak about this very issue and to be able to continue to hear from them, as with all of our Indigenous communities, on the work that continues to be done and needs to be done, not just by AHS, but also by the ministry, to be able to work to increasing access to our Indigenous communities and those who live within them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that many First Nations and Métis communities must travel into nearby towns and small cities for hospital care or to see a family doctor, and given that this government's cuts to rural health care have led to reduced access to family doctors in dozens of Alberta communities, and given that the chiefs of 6 First Nations in Northeast Alberta wrote the minister in late April regarding the, quote, urgent impending concern of loss of doctors' emergency services in their area, what analysis, if any, has the minister done on the impacts of the changes and cuts in health care he has had on Indigenous people and Indigenous communities in Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first question is very thoughtful. That one, perhaps not so much. Mr. Speaker, we've increased how much we are paying in our rural communities, especially in particular for the physicians who serve in those rural communities, Mr. Speaker. And I would also point out that soon we'll be announcing the second version of the ASLI program. Now, this is a program that the NDP canceled, and we're going to be announcing a new version of ASLI that's going to allow us to add new continuing care beds and throughout Alberta, 184 million, and a big part of it is actually going to be dedicated to continuing care beds for Indigenous people throughout Alberta in their communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that many expecting Indigenous parents have to travel outside of their communities for the birth of their child, and given that many of these parents are depending on one of the 28 labour and delivery rooms that the Minister has identified as potential for closure in his AHS performance review, will the Minister commit to Indigenous people in Alberta that he will not close a single labour and delivery department on which they depend? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member knows, the AHS review, which was completed in December, has an extension for the implementation plan to be delivered to us. It's going to be delivered to us on August 13th. But again, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be adding beds in the system in our Indigenous communities through focusing one of the 4 phases of the new ASLI program, $184 million, Mr. Speaker, for us to be able to add beds in our Indigenous communities so those folks can stay in their communities or close to them so they can get the care that they need and their loved ones who deserve continuing care can be closer to home.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Quote, "We did not cede title to the lands when we entered Treaty 8, but agreed to share our territory in peace and friendship." That was the Grand Chief of the North Peace Tribal Council telling this Premier to keep his hands off of traditional territory that the Premier planned on continuing to sell in a Phase 3 land transfer plan. To the Minister, why are you so intent on your plan to move ahead with the sale of Indigenous land when Indigenous groups clearly oppose it? Does the destruction of our natural habitats matter more to you than protecting constitutionally enshrined Indigenous rights?
The Honourable Minister of Transport and the Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm a little disappointed in the Honourable Member who never gets tired of riding a losing horse. He came in here in this House for months and claimed that the government was selling parkland, and he insisted time after time, day after day, week after week, until a couple weeks ago, where he actually stood up and said, "Yeah, we know you're not selling public land." And so he's back along a similar track today, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the NDP is you can't trust anything they say. That particular member said one thing for weeks on end, came in the House, admitted something completely different. Now he's back on the same track. I don't know what to say to this.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Given that I'm really looking forward to the member shaving his mustache so that Albertans can clearly see when he's lying, and given that the UN heritage...
Order. Hey, Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar. There are many things that are funny inside this chamber. That was not one of them. The Honourable Member will apologize and withdraw.
Mr. Speaker, given that the UN Heritage Site designation of the Wood Buffalo National Park is in jeopardy due to the effects of climate change and the threat of industrial development in the area, and given that this site sits downstream from Alberta's oil sands and so is potentially negatively impacted by the suspension of oil sands monitoring, can the Minister outline what is being done by this government to protect Albertans from losing an important historic natural site?
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, you can see how the Honourable Member reacts when I pointed out that that Honourable Member actually had to admit in this House that what he had said for weeks on end turned out not to be the truth. Also, so he's on another track that he has been corrected on by the Environment Minister a whole bunch of times. As the Environment Minister has repeatedly said, the environmental monitoring, about 98% of it has been ongoing. What hasn't been done has been only to protect people from COVID, our employees, our workers. And Mr. Speaker, the environmental monitoring goes on and the reporting will be caught up as COVID ends.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Well, given it's clear the Transportation Minister doesn't know much more about the environmental file than the Environment Minister does, and given that multiple First Nations communities are suing the energy regulator to reinstate critical monitoring of the oil sands, which was suspended with zero consultation, And given that the minister has recently authorized the energy regulator to return to monitoring, thereby showing to all of us that he always had that authority, why won't the minister reinstate monitoring today? What does he say to First Nations leaders watching today whom he forced to go to court to stop him?
The Honourable Minister of Energy and the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable member knows, the reporting and monitoring provisions have been reinstated. They were put on pause due to safety concerns for energy workers on site and to comply with public health orders. Mr. Speaker, as we are relaunching and we are going into phase 2, those reporting requirements have been reinstated.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that, as the largest infrastructure project in Alberta's history is ongoing while Calgarians struggle with crisis after crisis, Calgary City Council continues to fumble this issue that's so important to Calgarians. The incompetence at Calgary City Hall is best displayed by somehow they forgot to include $640 million in costs for the Calgary Green Line. This represents a significant expansion in cost of the project, which the provincial government has not yet had a chance to review.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable member that when it comes to the Green Line, we will continue to get the project done. Thus far, it is on time and on schedule. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to engage with the citizens that live near the project. We hear a lot from them, and Mr. Speaker, I don't blame some of them for not liking being near a big intrusive project like a ring road construction project, but Mr. Speaker, we'll be as sensitive to those needs as we can within government policy and within our requirement to get the job done.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the Calgary Green Line, given that the government's duty is to make sure that taxpayers' dollars are used responsibly, and given that Calgary City Council has already announced hundreds of millions in previously undisclosed cost, and City Hall's projections were set for 2028, which represents a massive 2-year delay. And given that the provincial government is contributing over $1.5 billion to the Minister of Transportation, what is the government's goal when reviewing Calgary City Hall's plan, and how will City Hall be held accountable for that plan for the Green Line?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Green Line, we have by legislation committed $1.53 billion. And we have committed to review with the city now that they finally finalized what their plan is to make sure it stands up to scrutiny for risk management, for the environment, for engineering, for usableness for those that would ride on it. And the Mayor of Calgary actually called it the next logical step when we said we were going to do that. So I guess that's the accountability. We are going to work with the city to make sure this is going to be done in a way that it is in Albertans' best interest.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore. Given that the Calgary Green Line, as the largest infrastructure project in Alberta's history, there's a large and increasing amount of taxpayer dollars on the line, and given that there are many unknowns regarding the project, and given that no complete business case has yet been presented, to Calgary City Hall, by Calgary City Hall, to the Minister of Transportation, what is the provincial government's role and what responsibilities does it have with the Calgary Green Line?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's a great question, and it's a good thing that the citizens of Calgary and of Alberta made the decision they did in the last election, because under the NDP there was no actual controls over the $1.5 billion commitment. They actually essentially wrote a blank check. Under our government, we put conditions on it that we can actually review the project with the City of Calgary to make sure it's in the taxpayers' best interest, to make sure it's in the city's best interest, and to make sure it works now and for the long term for the citizens, for the taxpayers, for the environment, and it will stand up to engineering and other scrutiny.
The Honourable Member for Vermilion, Lloydminster, Wainwright.
Madam Speaker, long-term and continuing care facilities are currently faced with a demanding set of priorities due to the COVID pandemic. But for years prior, seniors requiring extensive care have faced a lack of options. After 4 years of NDP mismanagement, our government promised more room for seniors by revitalizing the Affordable Supportive Living Initiative. Can the minister please describe the ASLI and what the government foresees as the future of long-term care in Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the future of continuing care is a system where government works with all of our partners in continuing care and put the needs of residents first. We've seen the strength of our approach, quite frankly, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic response. And as an example, we've seen 117 unfortunate deaths in continuing care, but that's compared to upwards of 2,000 deaths in continuing care in Ontario and 5,000 in Quebec, Mr. Speaker. So it's a future where it's government working with all of our independent partners throughout the system.
The Honourable Member.
Madam Speaker, given that when the NDP government took office, they put on hold many of the vital, affordable projects associated with the previous Conservative government's ASLI, and given that the NDP plan was to exclude private companies from the process, driving up costs, inefficiencies, and overall burden on the taxpayer, can the minister please let the Assembly know why a project like ASLI is necessary and beneficial?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to be able to speak about ASLI because this is a program that the NDP sidelined, along with every partnership with independent providers. And guess what? Costs went up and performance went down, Mr. Speaker. In Grand Prairie, as an example, this past March, there were 13% of our hospital beds were occupied by patients who were waiting for continuing care. But compare that, under the NDP, it went as high as 44%. In Lethbridge, in March, it was 4%. But under the NDP, it went up to 22% in Lethbridge. We need more continuing care beds, and that's why we're bringing back the ASLI program, and we'll work with all of our partners to build them, whether they're public, nonprofit, or voluntary independent.
The Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, given that seniors are valuable members of our society with families who love them dearly and wish for them to have the kind of care they deserve, and given that the current deficit in beds is largely due to the NDP's own top-down, biased and harmful initiative, and given that we as a party identified this NDP failure and proposed to renew the ASLI, can the minister please inform us as to the current status of ASLI and the number of new beds Albertans, seniors and their families can expect?
Speaker, and yes, we're restoring ASLI. We're going to be announcing this very soon because it's the best way to add capacity to the system, quickly and cost effectively. We're committing $184 million over 4 years to build new facilities and upgrade existing ones too. A big part of this is also going to be a refurbishment of our old stock in the system, Mr. Speaker. A recent example, we just committed $7.1 million to help build a new 75-space continuing care facility in Hythe. And we're looking at funding as part of our review of continuing care legislation led by the member for Calgary-Fish Creek.
That's good. Honourable members, in 30 seconds or less, we will proceed to member statements. How's that for confidence?
I'll send you that.
Honourable members, the member for Calgary North has a statement to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Canadian Multiculturalism Day. I love this province and the diversity of its people, including the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people with whom, on their traditional territory, we share this land. We are blessed to be living in one of the most multicultural country in the world. The wealth of diversity in Alberta has made us more innovative, adaptive, and better connected. Alberta was built on the contribution of Indigenous peoples and the pioneers who came later. We continue to grow stronger as newcomers join our communities. I am proud to look around and see many different cultures, backgrounds, and faith represented in this House. I think we can all agree that these differences are actually our strength, which means we can better represent Albertans and make decisions in their best interest. However, many of us have also experienced obstacles because of how others perceive us. Events over the past months have revealed cracks in our system. Our government will continue to stand against hate and discrimination and keep our promise to make life better for all Albertans. Supporting multiculturalism combats the fear and misunderstanding of those different from us. We will identify ways to build a province where all people feel safe, welcome, and valued. We are coordinating efforts to remove racial barriers, eliminate discrimination, and inspire Albertans to celebrate our diversity. I want our legacy to be a province where everyone belongs and all can pursue their dreams, and no one is left behind. That's the big goal. We must ensure that diversity of our province is reflected in all institutions. We need to listen and learn from cultural communities, leaders, and advocates. I look forward to be working with my colleagues in all Albertans to build a better future. And I welcome our special guests, if they are still here, Amy Sundberg, Chandresh Sonaj, Anokomi Okomi, and China Ogbendan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions.
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader has a notice of motion.
I rise to give oral notice of Bill 30, Health Statutes Amendment Act 2020, sponsored by the Minister of Health. And I rise to give oral notice of Bill 31, the Environmental Protection Statutes Amendment Act 2020, sponsored by the Minister of Environment and Parks.
My apologies. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give notice pursuant to Standing Order 15-2 that at the appropriate time I will be rising on a point of privilege regarding the deliberate misleading statements made by the Minister of Finance and the Premier. I have the appropriate number of copies of the letter which was provided to your office by the required time this morning. Thank you.
Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Honourable members, is there any tablings? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre is on his feet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table a letter I referenced in my remarks today, 5 copies of that, from Chief Greg Desjardins, the chairperson of the Board of Directors for Tribal Chiefs Ventures, Inc., on behalf of the leaders of Beaver Creek and Cold Lake Cree Nations, as well as Frog Lake, Heart Lake, Gahiwin, and Whitefish Lake First Nations, expressing their concerns regarding the urgent impending concern of loss of doctors' emergency services in Northeast Alberta.
Other tablings? Seeing none, I do have a tabling today. I have the requisite 6 copies of a mandatory review into child death report from the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. If you can just take that and throw it in the tabling box for me.
Tablings to the clerk. I wish to advise the Assembly that the following document was deposited with the Office of the Clerk. On behalf of Honourable Mr. Shandro, Minister of Health, pursuant to the Health Professions Act, Alberta College of Medical, Diagnostic and Therapeutic Technologists 2019 Annual Report. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods provided a notice of a point of privilege, and now is the time to hear that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on a point of privilege. As you know, and as you've said in this chamber many times, points of privilege should not be taken or entered into lightly. Points of privilege are a serious matter, and it's unfortunate that we have to address this issue today in the chamber. And it is unfortunate that matters such as this continue to be an issue for this legislature. But it needs to be addressed, as do many other serious matters that we address inside this chamber on a daily basis. Mr. Speaker, my point of privilege is lengthy in our efforts to make sure that you have adequate evidence for your ruling. Today, Mr. Speaker, I want to make first a number of references and then point to a number of facts that will lead to my belief that the Minister of Finance and MLA for Grand Prairie Wapiti misled this House and made misleading statements to this Assembly on May 27th, 2020, and later on June 22nd, despite interventions by the Auditor General to the government, the Premier and MLA for Calgary Lougheed doubled down and again misled this House and made misleading statements on the same topic. With respect to privilege and issues of contempt, you will find in House of Commons Procedures and Practice, 3rd edition, 2017, Chapter 3, page 82, where it speaks of breaches of privilege, a list of a number of those breaches, one of which says, and I will not read, Mr. Speaker, all of them. I think this is the one we're talking about today, quote, deliberately attempting to mislead the House or a committee by way of statement, evidence, or petition. Mr. Speaker, you will also find in Erskine May's Parliamentary Practice, 24th edition, on page 254, section 15, under misconduct of members or officers, under the heading, members deliberately misleading the House, the following. The Commons may treat the making of a deliberately misleading statement as a contempt. Mr. Speaker, as was indicated in my notice of breach of privilege, which met the requirements of providing the appropriate written notice as laid out in Standing Order 15.2, a member wishing to raise a point of privilege shall give written notice containing a brief statement, as I did, Mr. Speaker. To the Speaker and, if practical, to any person whose conduct may be called into question at least 2 hours before the opening of the afternoon sitting. You will notice that the written notice that was provided, I have provided, was stamped by your office at 11:18, providing more than 2 hours notice, and so, Mr. Speaker, allow me to lay out the facts. On May 27th, during question period, the Minister of Finance rose in this House in response to a question from the member for Lethbridge West. The member from Lethbridge West was inquiring about the status of the government's 2019-2020 annual report. In response to the member's question, the Minister of Finance stated, and I quote, "We've heard from the Auditor General that, publicly, the Auditor General has made the statement that they're concerned that they would not be able to actually complete their audit work before June 30th for the annual report related to March 31, 2020. So we're looking at legislative options to extend that reporting date likely to August 31, end quote. And the member from Lethbridge West responded by saying, and I quote, "Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. That was quite a helpful update. Thanks to the Minister for that." Mr. Speaker, to be clear, the Minister stated clearly that it was the Auditor General who raised concerns about meeting the legislative timeline for the release of the annual report, which is June 30th. And then, Mr. Speaker, this government tabled Bill 22, which, among other things, delayed the filing of the annual report to August 31, 2020, when this legislature is not expected to be sitting. This past Monday, the Premier was questioned again during question period about the rationale for delaying the annual report by the Leader of the Official Opposition. The Premier rose and responded. He stated in part, quote, "The Auditor General has indicated that their office is not in a position, because of the pandemic, to produce a report according to the normal schedule." In a follow-up question, the Premier stated, and I quote him here at length, quote, "I know it hurts, but what Albertans want are the facts, and the facts are this. The Auditor General is not an employee of the government. The Auditor General is an independent officer of the Assembly. The Auditor General has indicated..." There was an interjection, Mr. Speaker. He continues to say, "Oh, she's heckling. She's angry with the Auditor General too, not just voters. She's also upset with the Auditor General who, because of the pandemic, has indicated that their office is not capable of completing the review of the fiscal books at this point," end quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is clear from the Premier's comments it was the Auditor General that was the driving force for delaying the annual report. And it's clear that Bill 22, which legislates that delay, was motivated by the concerns of the Auditor General, at least according to the Premier and the Minister of Finance. Now, Mr. Speaker, what we have learned is that the Premier and the Minister of Finance have been deliberately misleading this House with respect to the rationale for delaying annual reports. We know this because we asked the Auditor General. On Tuesday, the official opposition contacted the Office of the Auditor General and heard a very different story. We heard that it was, in fact, the Ministry of Finance, and in particular the Controller of the Government of Alberta, in April, that initiated contact with the Auditor General to propose a delay in the annual reports. The government requested revised timelines, not the Auditor General. We also heard that roughly 150 employees work in that office, and significant changes to vacations and plans were made to accommodate the government's request. We also heard at length, Mr. Speaker, that the Office of the Auditor General was likely the entity best equipped to deal with the pandemic. The office is used to being in the field and working remotely. According to the Auditor General's office, despite the bulk of their employees working remotely, they were at 100% capacity. In fairness, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor Office did note that their performance audits might be delayed because that requires in-person meetings, but their financial statement audits could continue completely uninterrupted. And to be crystal clear, Annual reports involve financial statement audits and not performance audits. Now, Mr. Speaker, the official opposition learned of these facts in a telephone conversation. We realized rather quickly on Tuesday that the Premier and the Minister had been deliberately misleading this House. So we asked the Office of the Auditor General to send us the facts, and in writing, so that we could table them in this House. And the Auditor General, as an independent officer of this Assembly, which the Premier was clearly stating in his quotes earlier, agreed. I will table that document, Mr. Speaker, dated Tuesday, June 23rd. But I want to present verbally the position of the Auditor General from that submission. The Auditor General's office stated, and I quote, "To the Auditor General's knowledge, we never stated any concerns about our capability to complete our financial statement audit work by June 30th, end quote. And I would like to add, Mr. Speaker, that the Auditor, in a submission that the office knew would be tabled in this House, was crystal clear that the government was the one who initiated the delay to annual reports. Mr. Speaker, the official opposition only learned yesterday, Wednesday, June 24th, in the afternoon, of the full extent of the government's efforts to mislead the Assembly. On Wednesday, we went back and reviewed very carefully the Minister of Finance remarks on May 27th. I had the opportunity to confer with the member from Lethbridge West. By way of background, Mr. Speaker, if a minister misleads the House about an independent officer, particularly the Auditor General, it is common for that office to reach out to the ministry and set the record straight. As you would recall, Mr. Speaker, from the previous legislature, we had ministers occasionally misspeak. But if they did, they would come forward and set the record straight. And so yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we followed up again with the Auditor's Office to see, did they reach out to the Minister of Finance after the minister's misleading comments on May 27th? It turns out, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor's Office did exactly that. I will table copies of documents that confirm this that we received yesterday at 4:15 from the Auditor General's office. On June 1, the Monday following the minister's misleading comments on the Thursday, the auditor reached out to the Minister of Finance. According to the auditor, the government, and I quote, confirmed that the decision to extend the 2019-2020 year-end reporting period was a decision made by government and not at the request of the Office of the Auditor General. Now, Mr. Speaker, for your benefit and for the benefit of the public, let me state that annual report is a huge exercise across government. Every executive team in the ministry is involved, every minister is involved, every agency, board, and commission is involved. Cabinet is involved. And so the minister understood very well what he was asking the Auditor General to do back in April when he requested a delay from the Auditor General. And when the minister misled the House on May 27th, and then his ministry was informed that it was a misleading statement and not in accordance with the Auditor General's understanding of the facts, he did not stand up and apologize. In fact, he stuck to his story. And then the Premier drove that fictional story home on Monday. And so, Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by saying that we have conferred with the Auditor General's office, and we respect that office tremendously. And Mr. Speaker, if you so choose, you could confer with that independent office as well. And I would encourage you to do so in your deliberations. And I think if you did confer with that office, you would find that the Auditor General is quite displeased. The office does not like it when mistruths are told about that office. And he does not like it when mistruths are known to be wrong and yet still repeated by the government. And so, based on the presented evidence, the statement from the Minister of Finance, the statements the Premier made in this House, it is clear they are in contempt by deliberately misleading the Assembly even after the Auditor General's office had reached out to them to correct the record much earlier. It's clear that there was no request by the Office of the Auditor General to delay annual reports. The only statement made with regard to the Office of the Auditor General from actual emails from the office was that they would comply with the request of the government to delay the deadline for the Budget 2019 annual report until the end of the summer. Again, the request made by government. This was the topic of the question posed to the Premier, to get the clear answer on why this delay was included in Bill 24, a bill that is currently before the House and has passed through several stages based on the information provided to the members of this Assembly about why it was needed. And to that, the Premier clearly responded that, quote, the Auditor General has indicated that their office is not in a position because of the pandemic to produce a report according to the normal schedule, end quote. The Premier clearly showed contempt for this Assembly because he chose to answer a question by referring to a request that did not exist, thereby misleading the Assembly. Just as highlighted in Erskine May's treatise on the laws, privileges, proceedings, and usage of Parliament, 24th edition, page 254, states with respect to the United Kingdom, quote, "The Commons may treat the making of a deliberately misleading statement as a contempt," end quote. It is a three-part test for that to happen. First, as articulated by the former clerk of the New Zealand House of the Assembly, David McGee. For those following along at home, it can be found in the third edition of this book, Parliamentary Practice in New Zealand, on pages 653 to 654. The three parts of the test are as follows. 1, it must be proven that the statement was misleading. 2, it must be established that the member making the statement knew at the time the statement was incorrect. And 3, that in making the statement, the member intends to mislead the House. Let me address the first part of this test, Mr. Speaker. As confirmed by the Office of the Auditor General, there was no request made by that office to delay the date due on the annual reports. As confirmed by an email dated yesterday at 3:53 p.m., the Office of the Auditor General had communications with the government on June 1 where the official confirmed that, quote, "The decision to extend the 2019-20 year-end reporting period was a decision made by the government and not at the request of the Office of the Auditor General," end quote. The Minister stating on May 27th and the Premier again stating the same on June 22nd that a request was received by this independent officer of the AG was clearly misleading this Assembly. The Minister, the Premier of the government, my apologies, Mr. Speaker, the Minister, the Premier, and the Government House Leader may try to argue that they were unaware of this error. I would argue, after the government official acknowledged the request for the delay in the deadline on annual reports came from the government on June 1st, it would be ridiculous to believe that neither the Minister nor the Premier were aware, and further proves misleading of the House if that is their assertion. If the two highest-ranking members of this government are not aware why legislation is drafted, if they're not aware of the content after multiple cabinet and committee meetings and the whole government exercise, then we are in trouble indeed. In regard to the second and third test, the second test is that it must be established that a member knew it was a misleading statement, and 3, that in making the statement, the member intended to mislead the House. The fact is, established by the email communications from the Office of the Auditor General, the Minister of Finance and the Premier both knew no request came from the Auditor General. The Minister clearly knew statements were misleading, and particularly after the statements were first made and the office reached out to correct that record. In fact, on June 22nd, the Office of the Auditor General was so concerned about the contents of the reply by the Premier on that day that the Hansard of his reply was circulated to senior leadership in that office and marked as high importance. And the Premier knew on that day it was misleading, and he used the Office of the Auditor General as a scapegoat to justify decisions made by his government. How can this House take what the Premier has to say at face value? Do we not deserve to be able to trust the information provided as factual? Mr. Speaker, Albertans want honesty and transparency, which is why the Leader of the Opposition was questioning the Premier on their decision to delay reporting. And the answer provided by the Premier on June 22nd is deliberately misleading this House to avoid the issue and is a breach of privilege of the members of this Assembly. Also, Mr. Speaker, it does a great disservice to the independent Office of the Auditor General. At the very least, I believe that that office is owed an apology from this Minister, and the Premier and the people of Alberta are owed an apology from the Minister and this Premier. Mr. Speaker, I will close with this. It is very clear to me, and I hope it is clear to you, that the Minister of Finance and the Premier misled this Assembly while attempting to deflect a question in question period. By misleading this Assembly, they have misled Albertans. Certainly the Premier has, and as such, it is my hope that you too will find the same and that a prima facie breach of privilege has occurred. I have also brought the supporting evidence to be tabled at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Honourable members, as points of privilege are matters of a serious nature, it is not uncommon for members of the opposition to respond or to take time to prepare a response. I will ask the the Government Deputy House Leader if they would like to respond today or wait for a later time. And to be clear, at the next available time. It's not an open-ended time, but it would take place at the next sitting of the Assembly.
At this time, the government would like to avail itself of the opportunity to speak to the alleged point of privilege at the next sitting of the Assembly.
Honourable members, I accept the position of the government and look forward to hearing the arguments. It appears that the Honourable Deputy Government Opposition House Leader has a question. I'm happy to take it quickly.
Simply a correction, Mr. Speaker. And given the argument that I just made, I just wanted to correct the record. I appear to have referenced Bill 22 when I was intending to reference Bill 24, and I simply wanted to correct that. Right.
Let's start again. I might ask the indulgence of the House. Technically speaking, it would have been appropriate for you to table those documents prior, during tablings, or otherwise the Speaker would be unable to review any of those documents until tablings, which would take place at the next sitting of the Assembly. I might see if it would be the will of the House for unanimous consent to be granted to revert to tablings, and of course it's up to the House. Perhaps the Honourable Official Opposition Deputy House Leader might make that request, and we'll see if that can happen.
I would be pleased to, and I apologize to the House in preparing my remarks. I didn't realize that I had missed the opportunity for tablings, and so I impeach upon the House and ask for your understanding and request unanimous consent in order to table these documents that will aid the Speaker in his decision. Thank you.
Honourable members, the Official Opposition Deputy House Leader has requested unanimous consent to revert to tablings. I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed? If so, indicate now. Hearing none. The Clerk.
Tabling returns and reports.
Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you. I have 4 tablings at this point. The first is an email sent from the Office of the Auditor General on June 23rd at 4:15. Then I will just simply say at least 3 tablings. And Mr. Speaker, I've been given some Hansard records to table, but I will 4 tablings, all requisite copies. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are now at orders of the day, orders du jour.
Government bills and orders for third reading. Bill 17, Mental Health Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader on behalf of the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today on behalf of the Minister of Health to move third reading of Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act. The proposed amendments would enable us to achieve 3 important objectives. First, they would help us strengthen and protect patients' rights. The amendments would enable us to do a better job of providing what patients need when receiving care, such as more complete information and enhanced communications. Patients also need advice and assistance from legal advisors, advocates, and family members, to name a few. It's their rights to have these supports, and these amendments will ensure their rights are provided for and respected. Second, the proposed amendments would enable us to improve the care provided to patients by modernizing the Act and reducing red tape. With these changes, patients' care would become more timely and responsive, more easily accessible, and tailored to their individual needs. Finally, these amendments enable government to comply with the requirements of the Court of Queen's Bench decision within the timeline stipulated by the Court. Madam Speaker, making these changes is the right thing to do. I urge all members of the Assembly to support these changes and enable their implementation. So, Madam Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Health, I am pleased to move third reading of Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act. Thank you.
Are there any members wishing to speak to Bill 17 in third reading? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today in the House to speak to Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act. I can say that we were very pleased to see that legislation was being introduced to talk about mental health by the government. Unfortunately, when we've reviewed the legislation that they're proposing, there's a lot of disappointment and discouragement when it comes to what is actually part of this bill. We have many questions when it comes to this that I don't believe have been answered through the course of our debates regarding this piece of legislation. We are in third reading. There's still unanswered questions. I know I hear from my community about some of their concerns when it comes to this piece of legislation around mental health. I know for myself, I've worked in the area, working with those with mental health, June 27th is PTSD Awareness Day, which is a date that, as a private member, I was honored to be able to do as a piece of legislation with unanimous consent in this House. I believe that all members of this House know the importance of mental health awareness, reducing stigma, as well as ensuring that Albertans have access to the supports and resources that they need. So I'm concerned when I see that there's a lack of consultation about what was put into this piece of legislation. There's questions regarding the definition of harm, why that hadn't been ruled out. I know that over the years in working with youth, there was instances where youth were detained and apprehended, and caregivers were Form 10'd, and those were concerns that we continued to hear by the courts, by lawyers, by family members. That definition of harm needed some clarity, and this would have been a perfect opportunity to allow that to occur. Unfortunately, it didn't. We're also asking, when they look at the healthcare professionals that are able to determine risk, where that came from, who they talk to about the ability to make those determinations. I know that there's many hardworking, trusted health professionals across the province that have the skill set and the ability to do this. And we've been asking who helped determine this definition and this idea of who was able to make these decisions. When we look at mental health, we know that it's very, very complex. There's many issues that impact many Albertans in many different ways. And clarity is something that's needed, especially when we're looking at taking away someone's freedoms when it comes to their mental health, in their best interest, of course. And so the more clarity that you can have when you're doing this, such as defining the term harm, is needed. It's definitely a decision that I know many family members struggle with when they're calling to access supports for their loved one that's struggling with mental health. And if they had a clear definition of what harm was, it could assist in making that decision. I know as a social worker, I have received many calls about concerned family members wanting to know if their family member or their loved one had enough significant symptoms to warrant having them detained and being able to seek treatment. And so not having a clear definition is a little bit concerning, because I don't feel that this supports Albertans when they're trying to access services for their loved ones. I know something that we were hoping to see from this government is additional supports to the mental health to Albertans. When we're in the middle of a global pandemic and so many are suffering, perhaps many that have never experienced any sort of depression or trauma, when you put the circumstances onto Albertans that have never experienced these kind of restraints and strains, such as being at home all day, not being able to access your support groups, your loved ones, not being able to hug family members, it adds a lot. And we know when we looked at what happened in Fort McMurray with the fires and the amount of PTSD diagnosis that were coming out of that situation, we know that Albertans are going to be impacted. We know that there's going to be trauma. And so to be able to support Albertans in that, and to support the caregivers and the decision makers in that, is something that's essential. And I think that we were hopeful that this piece of legislation would be able to create some clarity for Albertans and to create some more hope in terms of what the services that would be available to their loved ones were. I know it's disappointing when we've worked so hard on this. The member from Edmonton Manning, as the critic, has done extensive work over her career in social work, as well as the critic for this very important file. And she presented several amendments that could have enhanced this piece of legislation and made it better. And she had some great questions that I unfortunately do not believe were addressed at any point in this debate. And it's a little bit concerning that we continue to stand up and advocate for Albertans, especially those that are vulnerable, such as those suffering from mental health, and to not have a response from government that addresses those concerns or even acknowledges that this amendment or proposed change or suggestion could actually help. And I think that that's really unfortunate that we're now in third reading and we don't have the ability to make the changes that unfortunately are probably going to have to come back once the court ruling comes in and may create change anyway. So, Madam Speaker, I would just like to say that, you know, mental health is something that we see as a concern in the province that should be properly supported and addressed. And I know that there is an intention in this House. They certainly talk about being able to support it, but we need to see that action. And I don't believe that this piece of legislation is enough to do that. So with that, I will close my remarks and allow for other members to speak. Thank you.
And members wishing to speak to Bill 17 in third reading. Seeing none, and would the Minister like to close debate? We're so closed. Can we do it without her? Can we do it without her? Just call the question. Okay. All right. Third reading of Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act 2020, has been moved. Those in favor of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Please say no. So carried.
Bill 17, Mental Health Amendment Act 2020, is now read a third time. Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Schweitzer.
The Honourable Government Deputy House Leader, on behalf of Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to move third of Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act. If passed, this bill will ensure victims have the support they need, promote public safety, and prevent crime. This proposed legislation will ensure that we provide the system, the tools and resources it needs to prevent Albertans from being victimized, and provide victims with the timely support they need and assurance that the perpetrators of crime will be brought to justice. Too often we've heard that Albertans can't access the supports for victims and don't have the proper assistance they need. This legislation will ensure victims of crime have the help they need when they need it, and it will give victims of crime access to more supports and services that they currently do not have. By increasing the victim surcharge from 15% to 20%, this bill will expand the fund from approximately $40 million to $60 million a year to grow the amount the government is spending on victim services and the prevention of victimization. It will help fill the gaps that victims and other stakeholders have told us need to be filled, and do more to stop the cycle of victimization before it starts. We have also established a working group to review the financial benefits program and consult with stakeholders and other Albertans on the creation of a new victims assistant model that will be launched in 21. While the program is being developed, we will still be focusing on victims who have experienced severe crimes and with an interim victims assistance program to provide new areas of support. These are resources and programs that we've heard victims desperately need but are not easily available or accessible. And services are being put in place because Albertans told us they are needed. Mr. Speaker, I hope members on both sides of the House will support this legislation. I request that we move third reading of Bill 16, the Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020. Thank you.
Are there any other members wishing to speak to third reading?
Government for indulging me this opportunity. I'd like to take a moment to request 1-minute bells. Unanimous consent, if I could, please.
Having heard the motion, we need unanimous consent to move to 1-minute bells. We'll ask one question only, and all those opposed to the motion, please speak now. We move to 1-minute bells. Any members wishing to speak to the member from Edmonton-Whitemouth, who is recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise at third reading of Bill 16, the Victims of Crime Amendment Act. I have had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to speak to this bill a number of times, as well as to hear the very thoughtful amendments that have been put forward by the members of the opposition in order to ensure that the government will do with this fund, through this bill, what it claims to be doing. And I've been very disappointed, and I think a number of Albertans will be very disappointed to see that we are unable to get a commitment from the government that the Victims of Crime Fund will be focused on serving victims of crime. And I believe this is another instance where Albertans are seeing the government be disingenuous about their intents and purposes behind bills that they're bringing forward to this House. They're saying one thing, but we are seeing absolutely something else. And when it comes to the Victims of Crime Fund in Bill 16, that is absolutely the case. We have been very clear, and I think Albertans have been very clear, and I've heard it said actually from ministers on the other side about how important it is to ensure that victims of crime get the support that they're entitled, that they need, and that they deserve. And yet we see with Bill 16, what is happening is that the Victims of Crime Fund is being raided, and that was a term used, Mr. Speaker, by stakeholders. The fund is now going to be used to fund the promises made by this government, which they did not plan for, and they did not actually have a budget in place to support funding for their commitments around police and prosecutors. They talked a big game, Mr. Speaker, but they weren't ready to actually fund or support the game that they were talking. They talk about increasing police and prosecutors. What they didn't tell Albertans is that it was going to come at the expense of other Albertans who deserve access to those supports. They didn't tell rural municipalities that, yes, we're going to increase rural police, but it's going to come at your expense. You're going to be the ones to pay for it. And now we see the exact same thing here, Mr. Speaker, with Bill 16. They told Albertans that they care about victims of crime, but what they didn't tell them is that they're going to pay for the supports for their police and prosecutor promises by taking it from victims of crime. And I'm deeply concerned because we proposed during Committee of the Whole on this bill a number of very thoughtful amendments that were intended to absolutely hold the government to their commitment. We introduced amendments to make sure that 75% of the Victims of Crime Fund would be held for victims of crime. The government did not support that amendment. They defeated it. We put forward amendments to make sure that victims of domestic and sexual assault would continue to have supports that go beyond the immediate term of their assault or their injury, because we know that a number of the injuries that are experienced by victims of crime, particularly those of domestic and sexual assault, are not resolved in a short period of time. They are long-term, lasting impacts, and these victims of crime deserve to have opportunities for those supports. And this government voted down that amendment. I've said over and over again in this House, Mr. Speaker, that Albertans are seeing this government for who they are. They are making big promises, but they are not following through, and they're not telling Albertans that they're actually going to hurt them by taking away much-needed supports for children, for witnesses to violent assaults who need these supports. They're taking those away in order to fulfill their campaign promises. Now, I've heard the Minister of Justice stand up and shout about how this means that the opposition is not supporting drug treatment courts. We absolutely support drug treatment courts, and I know a number of members in this opposition have put our support for that forward many, many times. But what we've also said is we support victims of crime. And when the minister stands up and says that this is for drug treatment courts, what he's not saying is he's taking away money from victims. We have not heard an acknowledgement that that's what he's doing. But every stakeholder, all these victim support groups, often volunteers who are out there doing that work, they know what's happening here. They know that now the money that was set aside to support victims of crime is now being used for a much broader purpose. So we all know what that means. It's the same thing we've been talking about on this side of the House since this government was elected. they're taking a pot of money and they're adding more people who will be accessing it, which means everybody in it will get less. This bill does not support victims of crime. This bill is actually intended to fund their campaign promises because they can't make that happen any other way, and they're being dishonest when they're saying that this is to support victims of crime. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I believe this is a flawed bill that's going to have repercussions for Albertans, and I cannot support it. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Airdrie East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill 16 in third reading. And, you know, we're here because the way in which we serve victims in our province isn't working. In 2016, the Auditor General released a scathing report about the way in which the Victims of Crime Fund is not working for Albertans. In 2016, who was the government? That's the NDP. So the NDP sat on a scathing report regarding the Victims of Crime Fund for 3 years and did nothing. Our government campaigned on supporting victims in this province, and that's exactly what we're going to do. This legislation expands the scope in which the Victims of Crime Fund can be used for prevention purposes. Less victims is better in the first place. But of course we know that won't actually stop people in this province from being victims. So we are going to do whatever we can do through an extensive consultation process to be able to come up with a formula that is equitable and actually addresses the issues that we currently have in this province. Stakeholders know that. They've been asking for years and years for this to be done. The Auditor General said it. We said it in our election, and this is the first government to actually take action on this file. We're going to make a difference in people's lives. It's sad to see that the NDP have used this initiative for political partisan gain, creating a sense of fear. This isn't holding the government to account, the actions in which the NDP have taken in regards to this piece of legislation. This is creating fear amongst individuals that have given their lives to support victims of terrible crimes in our province. We have a system that's broken. We're taking steps to fix it, and I look forward to the thank you from the NDP government when we do just that. I am very happy to support Bill 16. I am very honored to be the co-chair on the working group for the Victims of Crime Fund. I've had great conversations with the stakeholders thus far. We're going to do good things in this province. We're going to do right by Albertans, and we're going to do a whole lot better than the governments before us. So I urge all of my colleagues to vote for this, and I also would like to speak to Albertans and assure you that this government has your back. Despite the rhetoric that happens outside of this place, this is a government that's truly committed to doing it the right way. And we're going to work with our partners, and we're going to make Alberta a better place. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any other speakers wishing to speak to third reading Bill 16? 29-2A. Seeing none, any further speakers wanting to speak to Bill 16? Having heard... Okay, yeah. Deputy Government House Leader?
Debate.
Having heard the motion from the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader on behalf of the Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General, has moved third reading of Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020. Those in favour of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion is carried. We have a division. Reading the bells. Honourable members, we have a division on third reading Bill 16. All those in favour of third reading Bill 16, Victims of Crime, Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020, please rise at this time.
Honourable Mr. Panda, Honourable Mrs. Savage, Honourable Ms. Pond, Honourable Mr. Taves, Honourable Minister LaGrange, Honourable Mr. Glubish, Mr. Orr, Honourable Mr. Nicolaitis, Mr. Ellis, Honourable Mr. Hunter, Ms. Goodridge, Honourable Mr. Copping, Mr. Jones, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Getson, Mr. Williams, Mrs. Allard, Mr. Jour, Mr. Turton, Mr. Godfrey, Mr. Rosewell, Mrs. Pitt, Mr. Smith, Mr. Yassine, Mr. Walker.
Those opposed, please rise.
Ms. Gray, Member Carson, Mr. Fian, Member Loyola, Mr. Shepherd, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Schmidt.
Mr. Speaker, total for the motion 26, total against 7.
Motion on third reading Bill 16 is carried.
Bill 16, Victims of Crime, Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020 is now read a third time. Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020. Debate adjourned. Mr. Sabier speaking.
Are there any members wishing to speak? See the Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to rise to speak to Bill 7 and just take a few minutes to reiterate why members of our caucus are not voting in favor of this piece of legislation. First of all, I think it's important to remind all members of this House that the premise upon which this legislation has been built is not true. When the minister and the government brought this bill forward, they claimed that the timelines that the Alberta Energy Regulator took to make decisions was not competitive, and in fact compared us to Texas and said that there were a small number of projects that were more quickly approved in Texas than have been approved here in Alberta. Therefore, we must introduce this legislation to give Cabinet the power to impose these timelines on the decisions that the AER makes. And Madam Speaker, that is patently untrue. We know from a review of the timelines that the Alberta Energy Regulator makes, decisions faster than most energy regulators around the world. The bulk of applications are made, the decisions are made on the same day that they're received. And in fact, as I said earlier in debate, the energy regulator is proceeding to a system that will allow the regulator to make decisions within 15 minutes of receiving an application, which is lightning fast, Madam Speaker. And so I think it's important for all members to realize that this story that the government continues to spin, that the energy regulator takes too long to make its decisions, is not true. And I would urge all members of the House to look at the actual facts regarding the timelines that the energy regulator has with respect to the decisions that it makes. And I'm sure that upon closer inspection, all members would be satisfied that the energy regulator wastes no time in making most of its decisions. The important piece, though, to assert here is that this untrue story about longer timelines affecting investor confidence is not the problem, Madam Speaker. it's no doubt that there are a whole host of problems with respect to investor confidence in energy development here in the province of Alberta. But I would suggest to all members of the House that it's not the issue of timelines that are in question here. Restoring investor confidence requires restoring and enforcing environmental standards that exist and should exist in the province of Alberta. Now, we continually hear from members opposite that Alberta is the cleanest, most ethical oil in the world, and I hear that I hear the usual suspects in the back row cheering on this statement. What they don't say is that it is only on paper that Alberta has some of the most strict environmental standards in the world. And I appreciate the member from Lacombe-Panoka raising this issue, because he in his member statement earlier today, he talked about a very important issue that is damaging investor confidence in energy development in Alberta, and that is our inability to deal with climate change. And he talked for if the member from Lacombe-Panoka would give me the opportunity to address his remarks, I'm happy to do so, Madam Speaker. He correctly identified that the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line has gone into operation and stated that carbon sequestration is a part of the plan that the government has put forward to deal with climate change. And I appreciate the fact that we are at least doing something about climate change in this province, although I will say that carbon sequestration is probably the most expensive and likely the least effective method of dealing with carbon dioxide emissions. So it's curious to me that the members opposite would pat themselves on the back for supporting something that is so expensive and so inefficient, since they often tout themselves as such great financial stewards. It would be remarkable to me to go around bragging about something that costs so much money that does so little, but apparently that's what the member from Lacombe-Panoka and his colleagues in the government caucus are keen to do. But the carbon trunk line aside, there is much more that needs to be done with respect to climate change, and that's why we see this massive movement by institutional investors from all around the world to divest themselves from the oil sands here in Alberta. Now, I want all members to cast their minds back to the before times, and by the before times I mean before the pandemic emergency was declared here in Alberta, that a number of institutional investors have stated that they are divesting themselves from the oil sands. In February, BlackRock, I think it's the world's largest investment fund, said that they would no longer be investing in oil sands. We saw not long after that, that the Norwegian pension fund, one of the largest institutional investors in the world, has divested itself of oil sands shares. We know that a number of insurance companies are refusing to underwrite oil sands projects anymore. And all of those we also have Teck pulling its application. All of these investments and projects are not going ahead because this government has refused to take the issue of climate change seriously. And we know that the carbon trunk line notwithstanding, that the government has weakened climate change emissions reductions program. They pat themselves on the back for the so-called TIER program. We all know that the TIER program has weakened the regulations regarding climate change emissions from the oil sands. We know that they've also removed any other kind of climate action that would address carbon dioxide emissions in the province of Alberta that aren't related to industry. So half of Alberta's climate change emissions come from individuals like you and me, Madam Speaker, who have to heat our homes and drive our cars and do those kinds of things. And so if the government is so keen to allow the oil sands to continue to develop and meet our climate change targets, then we need to have reductions come from somewhere, Madam Speaker, and they just refuse to entertain the possibility that carbon dioxide emissions from any other sector could be reduced whatsoever. So they're intentionally putting oil sands investment at risk by refusing to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in any other sector in the province. And nothing in this bill addresses that issue of investor confidence. The other issue of confidence, because, Madam Speaker, the issue behind this bill that has been stated time and again is that investors need to have confidence in the ability of the energy regulator to do its work. The public has lost confidence in the Alberta Energy Regulator to be able to do its work, and speeding up the timelines that they do make their decisions is not the problem. What needs to happen is that public consultation needs to be enhanced, because the Alberta public has been all but shut out of the processes around energy development applications and hearings. In particular, I want to raise the issue of Indigenous consultation. Now, we know that Indigenous consultation is at risk, not because of this bill, but because of whatever one of the omnibus bills that I can't even remember anymore, because it's hard to keep track of all of the changes that this government puts into one 200-page bill. But we know that the minister is trying to give herself the ability to sign off on approvals of these oil sands development and take that responsibility away from Cabinet. And they haven't clearly answered how they're going to meet their duty to consult with Indigenous communities in this province. So that is, if the government is truly sincere in its desire to improve public confidence in the energy regulator to do its job, it would clearly state how it's going to improve the processes of consultation with the public of Alberta, in particular Indigenous communities, but also to all of those other affected communities that are currently shut out of the process. If we expand and improve those public consultation processes, I am sure the government would find that everybody's confidence, including investor confidence, in the energy regulator's ability to do its work would be improved. So, Madam Speaker, I'll close with a summary of my arguments against this bill this afternoon. This bill is built upon a foundation of an untruth regarding timelines, and it does nothing to restore investor and public confidence that is so sorely needed in the Alberta Energy Regulator. And for those reasons, Madam Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to vote down this legislation and get down to the real work that needs to be done to improve the energy development processes in the province of Alberta. Thank you.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, any other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, would the Honourable Minister like to close debate?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move I rise to move that we close debate on third reading of Bill 7.
The Honourable Minister has moved third reading of Bill 7, the Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020. On those in favour of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Please say no. No. So carried.
Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020 is now read a third time. Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 24, COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
Any members wishing to speak to Bill 24? Seeing none. Oh. The Honourable Mr. Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Minister of Health to move third reading of Bill 24, the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020. In total, Bill 24 proposes amendments to 15 acts across 17 ministries. These amendments will protect public health, support Alberta's reopening, and make life easier for Albertans. The bill was proposed as part of our government's ongoing response to the COVID-19 pandemic now that the state of public health emergency has ended. Emergency powers should last only as long as they're absolutely needed, and the state of public health emergency is no longer needed. However, protecting the health and safety of Albertans remains our government's top priority. The bill proposes to extend some of the measures that were in place in response to COVID-19 and introduces new measures to support Albertans. This bill will ensure government can continue to protect public health and effectively respond to the pandemic. Bill 24 ensures the intent of the ministerial orders put in place to respond to COVID-19 remains for as long as needed to keep Albertans safe. The proposed measures will ensure Albertans continue to have access to the services and support they need as we progress through the next stage of relaunch. We know that parents, for example, need access to safe childcare as they return to work. This bill will help do that. This bill also extends the unpaid job-protected leave related to COVID-19. This supports Albertans who need to leave work to care for a child for school closures or care for a sick or self-isolating family member. As well, Bill 24 introduces measures that make life easier for Albertans, including allowing for remote access to some legal services through the use of two-way video conferencing. These measures included in Bill 24 will not only support the safe and successful reopening of Alberta's economy, but will allow us to effectively respond to COVID-19 for as long as we need to protect the health of Albertans. Madam Speaker, I would like to provide insight into the discussions my officials have undertaken with the Office of the Auditor General in the context of the work on this year's annual report. Alberta has the earliest legislated deadline for annual reporting by 2 full months, Madam Speaker. Now, to be fair, I would like to point out that Saskatchewan has frequently released their annual report before Alberta, but they're not required to do so by legislation. Madam Speaker, even with the change we are seeking for this year only, due to the pandemic, we will remain one of the earliest jurisdictions for reporting this information. More than half of provinces are required to release their reports later in the fall, and even as late as December 31st. My officials consulted proactively with the Auditor General on the decision to delay the issuance of the Government of Alberta annual reports. Madam Speaker, it's important to recall the context of this decision. In mid-March, early April, we knew we were not in a situation where we could say, well, let's just see what happens. We knew it would be unwise to require ministries to fulfill their reporting obligations by deadline when their resources were required for frontline response to the pandemic. Madam Speaker, we had to make a call based on the collective wisdom of all the participants in the preparation of our annual report and what could reasonably be expected. That call provided the immediate clarity and transparency that was required by all accountable parties, who in turn could then work to a deadline that was more realistic given the situation we were managing. Like the broader public sector and Albertans all across the province, the Office of the Auditor General adjusted their normal course of operations. They issued a number of news releases on the topic. They decided to close their Edmonton and Calgary offices, cease on-site audits, as well as meetings with audit entities. We implemented similar changes across the Government of Alberta. Madam Speaker, government is comprised of 171 reporting entities. Those 171 entities are made up of additional entities. AHS itself represents approximately 80 entities, and the Ministry of Health represents by far the largest budget of any individual ministry in the government. Most of those entities are audited by the Auditor General, Madam Speaker, and the Controller and individual ministries work very closely with our Auditor General in the undertaking and completion of that work. In other words, Madam Speaker, we knew that ministries, and especially the Ministry of Health, would be hard-pressed to complete work on their annual report given the need to divert significant resources to the public health emergency. That in turn meant that information essential to the work of the Auditor General would be delayed, and the work of the Auditor General could then in turn be delayed. That was the basis of our discussion with them. Madam Speaker, perhaps the members opposite are suggesting that we should have diluted our response to the pandemic, but I respectfully disagree. Madam Speaker, I want to be clear that the intent of our comments has consistently been to underline that our decision to seek an extension to the deadline for the annual report for 2019-2020 was based on consultation with our partners. To be clear, Madam Speaker, this was a government decision based on consultation with the Office of the Auditor General. In conclusion, I would like to thank the members of the House for their support for Bill 24. I believe these measures will contribute to the well-being of all Albertans and support our economy as it recovers. I now ask the members of the House to put their support behind this bill. Thank you.
I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to rise to speak to Bill 24 at third reading, and I would like to borrow some of the language that I just heard from the Minister of Finance in my interpretation of this legislation. Bill 24 makes life easier for the government by delaying their accountability to a time when the legislature is not sitting. This government very clearly, in question period and throughout bill debate on Bill 24, blamed the Office of the Auditor General, specifically named them repeatedly, and said they were the reason that financial reporting needed to be delayed. That was the premise upon which Bill 24 has been debated in this legislature through first, second reading, committee of the whole. And now finally we are here at third reading only to find out, because someone picked up the phone to call the Office of the Auditor General, that none of that premise is correct. The minister has now used different language here today. Very different language. And I suggest that although there is a point of privilege under review, and I do not wish to presuppose any rulings or judgment the Speaker may have, that this member should really consider the language that he is using in the ways he's communicating with the opposition and with Albertans when he is furthering his agenda.
I hesitate to interrupt you, Honourable Member. Given the circumstances of the point of privilege that has been raised earlier today, perhaps the comments should very much so be directed around the bill itself, and I'll allow you the opportunity to do just that.
Madam Speaker, if I may, and I don't want to raise a point of privilege, the Minister of Finance just spent approximately 5 minutes telling the story exactly what is under debate. And I am curious why he would be allowed to present his version of facts, and yet I have been interrupted. I don't see that as being a fair or reasonable situation. I acknowledge there is a point of privilege. I do not mean to suppose any rulings of a speaker. But from my perspective, our entire debate on this bill has been done under false pretexts on a very key issue about financial and fiscal transparency with this government. And only now, as we move into third reading, we finally hear a changed story, something that significantly impacts the debate, or could have. And these members of the opposition did not have the opportunity to know this and to have this information during the earlier parts of the debate.
Honourable Member, we will focus on the debate on the bill moving forward. We will leave the issues around the point of privilege for a later date.
Madam Speaker, I do not believe we should move forward with this bill at this time, and I would like to introduce an amendment
Honourable member, this will be HA1. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that the motion for third reading of Bill 24, COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020, be amended by deleting all of the words after that and substituting the following. Bill 24, COVID Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020, be not now read a third time, but that it be read a third time this day, 6 months hence.
Are there any other members wishing to... Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. The time is yours. Please. Yep.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, this is my, I believe, first time moving a hoist amendment at third reading. This is an unusual, although part of the parliamentary practice, an unusual thing to do at this stage of the debate. And I choose to do it because of new information that has been shared regarding Bill 24 and the situations under which the decisions within this bill that this legislature is being asked to support. Given this new information, given that we now understand that the Officer of the Auditor General was operating at 100% capacity, that they are one of the offices best equipped to deal with the pandemic, being used to working from home. In fact, I have even heard that 150 staff had rearranged summer schedules to ensure that they would be able to complete timelines, and that financial statement audits could continue uninterrupted. I believe that this calls into serious question the debate that has been held around Bill 24, and I am quite concerned about these particular issues, which is why today it has been raised a number of times in the legislature and in this House. Accountability and transparency are something not only valued by Albertans, not only valued by the official opposition, but should be valued by everyone. And through the process of this debate, that is not what we were presented with. And so I put forward to this House an opportunity for this government to recognize the disconnect between what we were debating, how we were debating, the information we were presented, and what we now know to be correct, including what the Minister of Finance just referenced, the consultation proactively with government reaching out, and what he described as their decision to seek an extension. And it is under that basis that I move this hoist, and I encourage all members to support that hoist. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Are there any members wishing to speak to Amendment HA1? Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment HA1 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. Amendment has been defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells. Honourable members, a division has been called on Amendment to HA1 as proposed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods. All those in favour of the amendment, please stand.
Ms. Gray, Ms. Goring, Mr. Fian, Member Loyola, Mr. Shepherd, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Schmidt.
Those opposed to the amendment, please stand.
Honourable Mrs. Savage, Honourable Mr. Taves, Honourable Minister LaGrange, Honourable Mr. Glubish, Mr. Orr, Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Ellis, Honourable Mr. Hunter, Ms. Goodridge, Honourable Mr. Copping, Mr. Jones, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Getson, Mr. Williams, Mrs. Allard, Mr. Turton, Mr. Godfrey, Mr. Rosewell, Mr. Smith, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Yassine, Honourable Mr. Dreeshen, Mr. Walker.
Madam Speaker, total for the amendment 7, total against 24.
Members, that amendment has been defeated. Now that was a hoist amendment, we will now deal with the bill. So, on the motion for third reading of Bill 24, the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020, those in favour of the motion for third reading, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. No. That is carried. A division has been called to ring the bells. Honourable members, a division has been called on third reading of Bill 24. All those in favour of the bill, please stand.
Honourable Mr. Panda, Honourable Mrs. Savage, Honourable Mr. Taves, Honourable Minister LaGrange, Honourable Mr. Glubish, Mr. Orr, Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Ellis, Honourable Mr. Hunter, Ms. Goodridge, Honourable Mr. Copping, Mr. Jones, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Getson, Mr. Williams, Mrs. Allard, Mr. Jour, Mr. Turton, Mr. Godfrey, Mr. Rosewell, Mr. Smith, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Yassine, Honourable Mr. Dreeshen, Mr. Walker.
And all those opposed, please stand.
Ms. Gray, Ms. Goring, Mr. Fian, Member Loyola, Mr. Shepherd, Ms. Pancholi, Mr. Schmidt.
Madam Speaker, total for the motion 26, total against 7.
Honourable members, that is carried. I see the Honourable, no, I don't.
Bill 24, COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act 2020 is now read a third time.
Just jumping the gun. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you. It's been a long week, so we're all anxious to get out of here. So thank you, Madam Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 3 sub 1.2, I wish to advise the Assembly that there shall be no morning sitting on Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. And I also move that the Assembly adjourn until 1:30 p.m. on Monday, July 6th, 2020.
Having heard the motion to adjourn, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. House stands adjourned till 1:30 on July 6th.